So thank you very much for that, Louise. Quite a reminder, this year's my 25th year working for government in Scotland, which is something that I find completely incomprehensible. And in some ways almost, there's something quite good about hearing all of that, because it makes me think, actually, I have been doing something for the last 25 years, although sometimes it's really hard to believe. It's great to be here today. I've been following the work of the National Advisory Council and the circles over the period, and kind of feel almost like I'm an honorary member. And I hope that that's the way which you view me being here today. And I'm also delighted to be in Dundee. As Louise was saying a minute ago, one of the things in my current portfolio is the establishment of the new Social Security Agency. And of course, our operational headquarters are in Dundee. So it's been great to have an excuse to make far more trips to Dundee recently. Hopefully not as many of them take as long as this morning's did, but I know bits of Dalmeny Station better than I ever imagined I might. But it's great that I made it, and at one point this morning I thought I might not. As it happens, I am currently reading Invisible Woman, which I suspect quite a few of you will also have dipped into or read yourselves. I'm reading it, to be honest, partly on the recommendation of the First Minister, who, having read it, said that every policy maker in Scotland and no doubt elsewhere ought to read it, but also because it's hard to pick up a newspaper or walk through a bookshop at the moment without seeing the distinctive red and blue cover. And it was really interesting over the last couple of days to go back to read your report, your first report, and in particular your manifesto, against the backdrop of having been thinking quite so deeply in the last few weeks about a world which is not designed in all respects for women, and in particular to think about that given our collective responsibility for making and implementing policy. So it's really interesting to think about this topic of policy coherence, and I certainly will be interested in following your discussions and hopefully engaging in them in other ways over this year. But I thought what I would start off by doing today is just saying a little bit about what I think about when I think about policy coherence. Very pleased to hear what Louise was saying about getting into how policy is made, because I think that is absolutely the right way into considering this. In saying what I'm going to say, I suspect I'll be telling some, if not a lot of you, stuff that you already know, so I hope you'll bear with me in that. But I hope that you'll also hear something of the particular distinctive perspective of thinking about these things from within government, which might be slightly different to the ways that the rest of you have thought about and looked at these things before. So it's worth asking ourselves sometimes the kind of basic question, which is, what is policy? Because it's a word we use all the time. I have to be honest, every time I use the word strategy, I kind of go and Google it to make sure that I'm absolutely sure what I mean when I'm using these slightly overused terms. So when I think about the word policy in this context, in a government context, it's essentially the ideas and the plans that government uses as a basis for making and implementing decisions. And how does it get made? Well, if you were to go and look in the departments of universities or colleges which teach policy, or indeed if you were to go and look in the courses and developmental programs for people working in governments, you would probably pretty quickly come across something called the policy cycle. And again, if you Google policy cycle, you will find lots of neat little pictures that demonstrate a wheel that starts off at policy initiation stage, the very first time that somebody has an idea of something they'd like to change or something they'd like to do. And it goes all the way through consultation, hopefully, implementation, and then evaluation. And it's not an untrue picture, it's just a desperately one-dimensional picture. And I think if you were to ask anybody who has ever worked in policy, whatever point in the cycle they've joined it, they would say that it has a tendency to drastically oversimplify what is a very, very complex world. And I think my other reflection on it would be that it tends to remove the political dimension from policy making, and nobody who works either inside national or local government or indeed outside it thinks that removing the political dynamic from thinking about policy is in any ways a helpful thing to do if you want to understand the way that it works. And the other reason why I think it's a bit oversimplified is that it ignores this point about multiple interactions, which I think Louise also alluded to. If you were to look at government, what you would actually see, if you could conceptualize it visually, is lots and lots of cogs of policy cycles, all operating at the same time, some touching each other, some not. And if they do interact with each other, the likelihood is that they create all sorts of unintended as well as intended consequences. So if you think of government as lots and lots of these cogs, and to give you an idea of scale in terms of national government is divided in central government into over 30 business units, directorates. And although they're all slightly different in scale, there's probably over 100 divisions, each of which will own multiple policies. So when you think about policy, it's important to remember it operates at lots of different levels, and you can have very large policies, which within them have lots and lots of smaller policies. And of course, the other thing that's really relevant to the modern world that we operate in is the pace that policy is being developed and implemented at. And I know that many of my colleagues would say that it's a real challenge at that pace, with the level of demand, level of expectation, to make sure that even the policies within their own areas are relatively coherent, without trying to do that on a much bigger scale. So it is a mammoth task, but it is important, because with the duty that we have to get the best value for public money and to deliver the best possible outcomes, it's really important that you know that what you're doing is not actively undermining what one of your colleagues on the other side of the building is doing. And indeed, given that as civil servants, it is all of our job to support and deliver the overarching programme of the government of the day. If we are unwittingly doing something that pulls against that, then that is not a good place to be. And there are ways in which we in government do try to ensure a degree of policy coherence. And I'm going to talk about 3 of those today. And again, I know these won't be new to you. The first, and it's at a pretty high level, is the kind of overall dogma or political direction or political view of the government of the day. And while it is certainly the case that you can't look to that to answer every policy coherence question, I think as civil servants we recognise that that's quite an important overarching umbrella or container for what it is we do. The broad sense of, left and right, kind of more market supporting or more liberal, more social policy based, these things enable you to think overall about whether the way in which you are conceptualizing policy, the groups that you're trying to include in that, the outcomes you want to get, whether they are overall in line with what you believe the government of the day wants to achieve. But if that's all you had, it probably wouldn't enable you to do much more than make some pretty broad brush judgments about your policy. The second thing that we have, and I know that was covered in some detail in your first report, is the National Performance Framework in Scotland. And it's important in some ways not to understate how significant that is as an underpinning for policy coherence. A framework which, in its very heart and being, suggests that there is a linking philosophy and a linking set of outcomes for all that we do, and that the understanding of how those things relate to each other and do or do not support the overarching purpose is an important thing. And that was, of course, first brought in 2007, reviewed, refreshed, and revised through 2017 and 2018, with this purpose at its core of creating a more successful country with opportunities for all, increased well-being and sustainable economic growth, sustainable inclusive growth. And through the 11 national outcomes and the way in which we talk about how we want to achieve these, a very strong emphasis on equalities and on furthering and protecting human rights. One of the quite important things which has been associated with the refresh of the National Performance Framework has been a renewed discussion about data. And of course, Invisible Woman draws very strongly on this question of what it is that we know and what it is we do not know about the experience of women and the extent to which policy reflects that. The new Equality Evidence Finder has the potential to be really significant. So the Equality Evidence Finder enables us to track progress on various policies and outcomes by a whole range of equality characteristics. And this has the potential, I'll come back and say something about it in a few minutes, has the potential to enable policymakers, but also critically all of you, everybody else, people with an interest in how policies are having a differential impact, to actually go in and see what the story is telling us, but equally important, what the data can't yet tell us. So I was flicking through it last night, looking at various outcomes by gender, and it is really interesting what it tells you about the poverty rate for women, slightly higher in recent years, about how the gender pay gap has fallen a bit over the last decade, the fact that women-headed households are less likely to be managing well financially. It tells you some interesting but not yet complete data about how girls perform in the education system compared to boys, what the level of positive destinations is, marginally better for women at the moment. And all of these things start, I think, to help us understand as policymakers better how you can use an overall framework for outcomes to enable you to make individual policy choices. But I think it's still important to remember that there is quite a long distance to be travelled between that beautiful flower or set of cogs and decisions that people are making day in, day out. And again, although I think the visual representation of the National Performance Framework is in many ways fabulous, again, I would advise people not to be seduced by the apparent simplicity of a design. It is really, really complex, hard work to understand which policy choices and how you implement them works positively to achieve outcomes or doesn't work positively, or might work positively towards one outcome while undermining another. And the areas which have done most work, and quite often a lot of it's around the justice system in order to understand how to deliver outcomes, attest to the extent to which that contribution analysis and deep, deep work takes time. It takes working right across sectors and beyond in order to understand varying contributions. So I wouldn't in any way want anybody to think that just because we've had a national performance framework for over 10 years now, that we've cracked it all. Frameworks are not everything. But it is important to know that in government, every time you propose a new policy or you make a proposition about the way in which a policy could be changed, you have to actually state explicitly what its contribution to the national outcomes is. And equally, if you think that it might in some way be detrimental to national outcomes, you have to say that as well. And again, maybe a bit of a blunt instrument, but it's one of these things that is used to get people thinking. And then finally, at maybe a more granular level, the question of how we can promote coherence in relation to gender equality. Clearly, under the 2010 Act, the government has a public sector equality duty, and that requires us to do a number of things. We have a number of equality outcomes that government is committed to. An equality impact assessment is a very significant tool there. It's a basic requirement of good evidence-based policy making, and it's a structural process which is undertaken when developing or revising policy that uses evidence. Again, absolutely critical, the evidence is brought to bear to better understand the impact of the policy proposition on a range of people who have particular characteristics. Critical that it's not done after the work is finished, but that it's something that people are thinking about all the way through developing the policy. And of course, the Council's recommendation on gender sensitivity of future proposals in programmes for government is something which is very much sitting in the context of this kind of work. There is governance in place to try and make sure that that happens. As a Director General, I receive assurances from all of the people who lead my policy units, and this is the case for all Directors General, that they have done equality impact assessments where they should have done and that they've done them properly. And of course, we also have the equality budget process, which has been in place for 10 years now, world-leading attempt to make sure that the impact of spending propositions in the government's budget each year are properly tested against equalities analysis. And of course, there is a whole range of specific initiatives in place as well, whether it's a gender pay gap action plan, work on gender representation on public boards, looking at pregnancy and maternity discrimination in the workplace. So there are lots of things happening. But, and this is a really big but, and I suspect it's around this but that a lot of the work that you will want to do and the value that you can add sits. All of this structure and process relies really, really heavily on the culture and the capability and the understanding of the people who are responsible for working the process. And it also interacts in quite interesting and sometimes unpredictable ways with the systems within which they work. So it's great to have an equality evidence finder. And the development of that over the next few years will be a really, really significant thing that government can do in this space, recognising that it's important government focuses on what only government can do well. But unless it is used really, really thoughtfully and intelligently to inform decisions, to challenge decisions, and also to point up the questions about where data doesn't exist, then we may as well not have it at all. So leadership in this space, I think, is about giving emphasis and priority to the underpinning processes, but recognising that processes in themselves are not enough. And it also is about asking the right questions. We do need to keep building the skills in knowing how to do this well, how to use the data, how to frame the questions, and we need to understand the role that systems play, and I'm not sure that we are as mature as we would want to be in that at the moment. The thing that I would say to people who are working in policy in government is be curious. Don't take what you see at face value. Don't settle for the obvious answer. And evaluate policy with real care before you go into the second ring of the policy cycle and either change things or redo what you've done already. So, if I may be so bold, I thought I'd end with some suggestions about things that you might want to think about and ways in which you might want to go about your work on policy coherence. And I think my first point, which again Louise has kind of helpfully said for me, is do take the time to understand and to be curious about how policy gets made. And I encourage you to engage with the complexity and the messiness. It is messy and it is complex, but if you don't try to understand how that feels and how that plays out, then I think your understanding will only be partial. And I don't just mean the administrative complexity, but I mean the political complexity as well. I think it's an interesting question to ask whether people working within policy systems feel that they have the agency to be gender competent. Do people feel that they are pushing against a system in order to bring these issues to the surface, or do they feel that the system that they are in facilitates and supports them in doing it? I encourage you to look for good practice examples. We can learn so much, not just from the outcome of doing things well, but what it was that enabled people to do things in a way that we regard as good. And if did they manage that in spite of the system they were working in, or did the system that they were working in support them and help them to do that? And I think ending more or less where I started, don't overlook the importance of culture and skills and systems. It's really, really easy to describe a process, and it's relatively easy to implement a process, and it's quite easy to hold people to account for whether or not they followed a process. But in the same way that they say that culture eats strategy for breakfast, in my experience, culture eats process as well. So one of the biggest contributions that you could make in this year of thinking about policy coherence is to challenge us, to challenge all those involved in policy on the way in which we are embedding cultures and understandings and skills and capabilities and confidence in our policy making, which will enable us to achieve the ambitions that we all have. Thanks very much.